Welcome to the Cup of Joe Show, where we explore the journey of recovery from alcohol and drug addiction. One story, one conversation, and one step at a time. I'm your host, Joe, creating a safe space for honest discussions about the challenges and triumphs of addiction and alcoholism. In each episode, we'll hear inspiring stories and uncover tools that make healing possible. Sobriety is not a one-size-fits-all journey, and you don't have to face it alone. Recovery is possible, and it's worth it. Thank you for joining the Cup of Joe Show. Now let's get started. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Cup of Joe Show. I am super excited about my guest today, and in a moment you'll know why. She is very special to me, not just to the Cup of Joe Show, but to me personally. Katie V has been living in recovery since May 23rd, 2008. And I've had the absolute privilege of walking that journey beside her because she also happens to be my amazing wife. Katie's a proud mom to Ethan, Emma, and her bonus daughter, Eleanor, as well as a loving pet mom to Penny the pup and Tux the cat. When she's not geeking out over ancient Roman or Christian history, you'll find her glamping, yes, that's glamour camping, with our family and friends in Crossville, Tennessee. So grab your cup of coffee, settle in, and let's get into it. Why, hello, honey. How are you doing?
I'm good. Hi.
Thank you so much for agreeing to do this with me. This has been an ongoing conversation in our family, and I have a lot of respect for Katie and Katie's recovery. And I thought she could definitely help some people out there. So I'm glad she's on the show.
Well, absolutely zero preparation for this show. So you're going to get what you get. We'll see how it goes.
That's the way we like it out there, folks.
That's how I live life.
So, so tell me, what was it like growing up, Katie?
Complicated. I was just a very, very sensitive kid. Grew up in a family that didn't really talk about or really deal with emotions. And I think that was probably something significant early on. But really, I was honestly a very imaginative kid. I could go anywhere in my mind, and that was a really, really great way to cope as a kid. But then, there were signs early on that there were also some, little inner struggles with me too. I had a really hard time paying attention. I use this time wisely was always something that I got unsatisfactory in school. And I tended to have different opinions and didn't have a hard time saying that. I was considered like a naughty kid, if that makes, sense to anybody. But, all in all, I think I really was just, a regular kid who happened to have a brain that was wired for addiction. And there were signs early on that could be a possibility. I can remember going to my Aunt Jo's house, and she gave me a pack of gum, and I ate every single piece of gum in a matter of a few minutes. And I remember her saying to me, "You better never pick up cigarettes because you'll probably have a hard time quitting." And what was that foreshadowing of what was to come? But life, as a kid was pretty interesting too. I had a father who was from another country. My dad was from Italy, and he was an immigrant. And my mom was from a big Irish Catholic family, and my dad worked for the airlines. So I got to experience a lot of great culture. My parents were blue collar workers. They didn't have a lot of money in terms of being able to provide that for us, but they did provide a tremendous amount of culture by bringing us on different trips all over the world and introducing us to people from different places. And so we had that, real wealth of experience as kids, even though, we didn't have everything. But all in all, it was, a fairly happy childhood.
What was there anyone in your family that had an issue with alcohol or drugs that you knew of?
Well, yeah, a whole lot. But I should say that's in hindsight. We all see that now. I don't want to say too much about family members if they're not here to be able to speak for themselves. But yeah, there was definitely some pretty significant history of alcoholism and mental illness on my mom's side of the family. my dad's side of the family, it was really a lot harder to get information out of them, but there were some stories about my father's mother having serious mental illness. So that was definitely there. But, in their times, they didn't talk about it. That was not something you presented to the public. That was something that you hid away or you called it something else. I remember my grandfather used to call alcoholism the curse of the Irish. That was just how he explained it. And, it was something he grew up seeing. And, that was basically part of it. So, but yeah, there was definitely, seeing that in the family. But my parents, no. Neither of my parents had a problem with drugs or alcohol. That was not something that I saw in my home. So in that regard, no, it wasn't normal to me.
So what was I know you talked about the pack of gum, and I think that's a really, really interesting, like, kind of wow, looking back moment,
Yeah.
Were there other signs for you? Other
Oh,
things that kind of made them looking back?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, food was another one. Really anything that made that part of my brain light up was going to be a problem. But basically, I just didn't have an off button in a lot of regards in my life as a kid. I pushed a lot of boundaries. I mean, as far as that, those, the real signs I think are just in what I just didn't have an off button in a lot of ways. I would eat, I would eat until I couldn't eat anymore. I would, if I was reading a book, I read until I absolutely passed out. As a kid, my parents, it's funny, we didn't have TVs in our room, so that was never an issue. But my parents would have to come in and take the flashlight away in the middle of the night because I'd be reading. So there was just, everything was two extremes. I didn't have any real balance. And that showed up in other things too. Any schoolwork or, career-wise work I've ever had to do, everything has been done last minute because if it's not interesting or urgent, it's just not going to happen. So yeah, I mean, today as somebody who works in the addiction field, I can look back and see 1,000, little red flags. But all in all, how do you know as a parent, what's typical, what's troubled, and my parents certainly didn't know what I was going through, especially as a teenager, because it did take a very serious turn. My mental health did as a teenager, and things got a lot crazier, got a lot more self-destructive. I became promiscuous. I, would sneak out in the middle of the night. I would have to be, brought home by the police. My parents tried everything they possibly could, to punish it out of me. But that was what they didn't understand, was you can't punish mental illness out of somebody. And that's not what they understood it to be, because what it looked like was, anger and dangerous behavior and defiance is what it looked like to them. But it was a lot more.
So how old were you when if you remember, feeling like the effects of either alcohol or drugs?
So I was 14 when I first, like the summer between 8th grade and 9th grade was like the pivotal summer of like trying things. I remember me and a couple friends said, we're going to teach ourselves how to smoke cigarettes this year. Like that was the goal. What a nice goal. And you could still get cigarettes back then as a kid because they had these cigarette machines, and I would save my lunch money every day, for cigarettes. But so that's what we did. We bought cigarettes one summer and were determined to learn how to smoke, and sat behind the block. We called it the block. It was basically this concrete, a concrete barrier thing at the park near our old neighborhood. And a lot of bad things happened behind that block. But we taught ourselves how to smoke, and then from there it became, what else could we get into? And I remember the first time I got like a buzz from alcohol was also that summer at my friend's house. And I remember driving home with another friend's brother was driving us back home. And as we're driving back home, I saw a friend at the McDonald's drive-thru, and he was trying to wave to us. And I guess apparently my waving back out the window of the car was a little more than he anticipated, because he, in a look of terror, slides back in his car and rolls up the window because he's with his mom and we're kids. And it was just a disaster. But That's the first time I remember, being drunk. But from there on, it was whatever we could do, whatever we could do. It didn't stop after that.
So were there other things like that, other, I'm trying consequences or things that you kind of think about, like, gosh, maybe I should have done something different as you got older? Because through high school and into college and that kind of stuff.
I mean, honestly, now looking back, I don't know how much control I actually had over myself, at that point in time. I don't know really what could have been changed, especially when I look back, and a lot of those experiences and coming to understand the meaning behind those experiences is what got me to a healthy place. So I don't know if I could, if I should, or if I would have. Yeah, I mean, of course I can, look back, all things being equal, and say, wow, I really wish I hadn't screwed up my last couple of years of high school. I wish I had gone straight to college, but that just wasn't the reality of it. I got into some very serious trouble not long before my 18th birthday, and it was enough to have to leave school, basically in scandal. And, that was enough for a little bit to kind of shock me into a state of manageability. That's something in AA literature talks about, that there were times of regaining control followed by still times of less control. That has been my experience in addiction. I would suffer a consequence that was scary enough or big enough to get me to kind of pull back or white knuckle it for a little while, and then things would get better and something would happen and I'd have an opportunity. And of course, I don't understand addiction at this point, so I don't realize I'm powerless over the first drop of it I put in my body. I think like you have to willingly lose control over that stuff. I just had no concept at the time of what addiction really was. So after, I had that very serious consequence just before my 18th birthday, and it was enough to scare me back into, a decent way of living for a brief period of time, enough to basically continue, finish my first 4 years of college, sort of. Joe, that story. We can get to that later. And then, I very soon after that, my last semester in college, I had started using again. I hooked back up with some old friends. And I just remember one night hanging out, and they were like, do you like to party? And you know what that means. And, and that was it. We were off to the races, and that became my next several years, really. With the exception of brief stops for pregnancies. I graduated college, sort of, April of 99, and found out I was pregnant with my first son, June of 99. And I was very grateful that I was able to not use any drugs or alcohol throughout both of my pregnancies. And I say that simply because I was not an opioid addict at that time. And I really don't know what would have happened if I had have been. I have a tremendous amount of empathy for women who are addicted to opioids and who become pregnant. It's, they experience more stigma than any other group, even in recovery. So I just have a real heart for them. And I'm very aware of the fact that there, but for the grace of God, go I, that it very easily could have been me, and as a mom, I would never, ever do anything to endanger my kids for a drink or a drug. But I know with certainty today that I would give them up in a heartbeat for the second one. And that's just the nature of addiction. And, some people may not understand what I just said, but for the people who do, they get it. So where am I at, Joe?
Well, you're as awesome as ever, just so you know. Were there, I know you said there was moments like, when you were pregnant with Ethan and Emma that you actually were able to stop, but were there other times outside of that you tried to stop and realized you couldn't, or anything?
Well, I mean, I think when I really actually wanted to get sober, for the first time when I realized like my life was completely unmanageable. And this was probably at the point of when my kids were about 2 and 4, a little bit before that. Probably started around 1 and 3. I had married their father. We had been high school sweethearts. We'd been together for many, many years, but it was a very unhealthy relationship. We both have our very large part to play in that unhealthiness. But his part is for him to tell. But at this time, I'm at the height of my addiction. I had taken a year off of work to try to save my marriage and be a stay-at-home mom, thinking that will fix it. In the meantime, what that did was make me extremely depressed, and my addiction got completely out of hand, and that year almost killed me. And I had a very bad night where I had gone out drinking all night long, and I had come home and I wasn't working. So, the kids are with me, and their father had left for work, and I was so sick that I just wanted to go in the bathroom and be alone for a minute, because if you know what it's like to have toddlers, you don't get a second alone. They literally hang off your legs while you're in the bathroom, and I didn't want them to see me that sick. And so, I finished being sick, and I come out of the bathroom, and the silence terrified me. And I realized something was wrong, and I ran to the kitchen, and the door from the kitchen to the garage was open. And I ran out into the garage, and the door from the garage to the side yard was open. And I ran out there, and the gate to the front yard was open. And I run out, and I see my little babies walking down the middle of the road, holding hands in their little diapers, while cars are lining up down the street trying to leave for work. And here comes this crazy looking woman at 7 a.m. running down the street in hysterics, to get these kids. And that was massive for me. I called my parents as soon as I got back in the house. I told them that they needed to come pick up the kids, that I was basically having a nervous breakdown. And I don't know if it was that day, the next day, or how soon after, but my brother and my sister-in-law came knocking on the door. And I think they were there to try to do an intervention, but it was unnecessary, because the minute they opened the door, I said, "Where am I going?" And I checked into a treatment center in South Florida, and my husband at the time didn't even know where I was and what I was being treated for. That's how communicative we were at that point. And I was served divorce papers while I was in treatment. And that was something I'd always said, that, I could never tell him what was happening, because the minute I said anything, he would take the kids and leave me. And that is exactly what he did. But that's okay, because that's exactly what had to happen. It really did. So, that treatment scared the hell out of me. And I thought, I will never, ever use again. I mean, my life had just imploded. My husband's left, my kids are not in my custody, my entire family knows. I'm humiliated. This will never happen again. But again, I didn't understand the true nature of addiction, and I didn't understand what it really meant to be powerless. And so ultimately, I eventually ended up in a 4-year-long relapse, where things got very, very, very serious, in terms of my drug use. And, all of the dangers are magnified at that point. And I remember that was when I was in a place of complete and total slavery to what I was doing. My entire day was about the getting and using. I had to. I was in withdrawal every 12 hours. There was no way around having to deal with that. And it was finally after just like a 4-year period when I couldn't even hide it anymore, that my father had passed away. A lot of things occurred in this 4-year period that we can talk about another day. There's too much. But I remember saying to my mom, I need you to take me to a methadone clinic. This was back in 2007, really at the dawn of the opioid epidemic. And Suboxone, I think, was available, but not readily available. But methadone was. And my sweet mother managed to basically carry me into a methadone treatment. And I was able to receive treatment that day. And I talk about that a lot now, that the ability to walk into that clinic and get help that day made a tremendous difference for me. And I've been a huge advocate for same-day treatment ever since then. Whatever you think about certain types of treatment, same-day access is a lifesaver. And I hope a lot of people take that to heart. So that started my journey with medication-assisted treatment. while I was on that, 6 months of that was long enough to get my life together enough to realize that I wanted to be where the kids were. My ex-husband had moved to East Tennessee, which could have been Mars as far as I, knew. I was from South Florida, Fort Lauderdale area. I was never going to move to someplace like East Tennessee, never. But my ex-husband had moved there and my children were with him and I was not going to be away from them. And so packed up whatever I could in my little beat up car and moved to East Tennessee. And man, this was back in the days where things weren't that easy. I had to go to the library and get on the internet there. And I had to go on Craigslist and try to find an apartment with no credit, no rental history. I ended up finding a basement apartment that was for rent and it was $455 a month and it included all of my utilities. It was the most amazing God-sent gift I've ever received. I lived there for the first 4.5 years of my recovery. I couldn't have, and because of that, I was able to live on my own without a roommate. So I didn't have to worry about that level of safety for my kids when they came over. Was able to provide them a stable place while I was getting my life back together, so total gift. All right. So where am I at, Joe? How should I?
You're doing great.
I know,
You don't need, as usual, you don't need me, Katie. I need you, honey.
Well, I just kind of need to know where to. Okay. All right. So let me think. Where am I at? This is. So I land in Knoxville and I'm on methadone. So I like to call it medication assisted recovery. I am in recovery at that point, but I don't think so. Because at that time there was a lot more stigma about medication assisted treatment. This was 17 years ago. And I remember I was on methadone for the first year I was here in Knoxville, and I was reducing my dose the whole time. And I'd have to see a counselor every week that I was there. And every time I'd see her, I would just be in tears, just horribly depressed. And, she would, essentially, because I was in withdrawal the whole time as I'm coming off of this medicine. But not terrible. It doesn't feel like what you normally think it feels like. It just didn't feel fun. But she always said to me, why don't you go to AA? Why don't you go to NA? Why don't you go, because I had done that before and I found tremendous relief there. And I remember crying to her that I couldn't go because I was on this medicine, that I wasn't sober and I couldn't go until I was off of it. And so, as you can imagine, I'm a pretty big proponent of that's bullcrap. Now, I understand each fellowship has their own program of recovery. They have their own traditions. They have their own, little T traditions or suggestions, if you want to call them. And everybody has a different opinion on this stuff, but ultimately, I think that it's very dangerous if we get to a place where people feel like they can't come and be a part of something. I don't know. They feel like they can't be a part of something because maybe a certain factor of their recovery doesn't look the way you want it to. So anyway, I don't know. What I say to people now is, if you're unsure, you can always ask somebody, and typically I like to think that God directs a lot of that and can put you with a person who has lived experience with that or is a little more understanding of that, regardless of which fellowship you're a part of. And I know, in my story, it can be controversial for some people. I identify as an alcoholic in recovery out of respect for the fellowship that saved my life and because I'm a sober member of Alcoholics Anonymous. But as you can tell from my story, there's a tremendous amount of drug use in it, and it is what ultimately brought me to my knees. But I can tell you that when I drank alcoholically. And for me, it doesn't matter what brand of alcohol I drank. What matters is that I share the same common solution that everybody else in the fellowship does. And ultimately, that's what holds us together, I think. So anyway, though, so I get you out here. Did you want
Beautifully said, honey. Beautifully said. So, what helped you stay committed early on in those tough days?
That first year on medication assisted treatment, or when I actually finally came into the rooms? Well, that first year was just, I was doing this thing. Because I had just gotten to a place of what was I going to do? Was this going to be my existence? Like I tried to explain it to people, like my bottom wasn't a single event. My bottom was living in a way I couldn't tolerate living for a very extended period of time. Desire and opportunity don't always align at the same time, so bottoms can last a very long time. Where was I going with that, Joe? This is menopause brain here.
Talking about tough days and how you stay committed.
Okay. So, I'm sitting in this little basement apartment, right? And I'm here because, my life looks the way it looks. I'm going to go ahead and say 99% because of what I have caused in my own life, and I just realized, I kind of had a choice. Was this what I wanted? I had already lost, all my material things. I didn't have primary custody of my kids. Like all the big stuff was already gone. Was this going to be it? And, I'm very fortunate that I did come from a family that exposed me to a lot of good stuff too, and so I knew there was a better way to live. And I always say that too, that's a privilege that really gave me a leg up in recovery, was the fact that I came from a family that in some ways had their crap together. Like I knew that, you're supposed to go to work, you're supposed to pay your bills, you're like, I just kind of knew, how to live my life if I wanted it to look differently. And so, but not everybody does. Some people have terrible examples set for them. And I think that that's something too, we don't all start at the start line in the same spot, so I had that. But so there was that, and my kids just wanting, I just became committed, and I don't know, I just kind of had, what else was I going to do? And so I just started doing the right thing. And then once I got into AA, I was so lucky. I got snatched up. I ended up coming in. So my sobriety date is May 23rd. And I actually ended up coming into the rooms 5 days later on my actual birthday, because that's when I hit the wall on coming off of methadone. Basically, you get to a point and then you just kind of have to jump, and deal with it. And the next 30 days was extreme with, discomfort and withdrawal, but not so much physical. That part's easy. It's more of extreme, intense anxiety. Like I try to describe it to people as, think of the worst butterflies you've ever had in your stomach, ever. And I had that for 30 days, 24 hours a day straight. It was extremely difficult. And I remember day 14, I talk about this a lot when I share my story about day 14. On day 14, I really didn't know what I was going to do. I was in a place of, I'm either going to use or I'm going to kill myself, or something else is going to happen. And I had these little things I would do. Like I had a mantra I would say over and over that really helped me. I would say, this is what it feels like when poison leaves your body. This is what it feels like when poison leaves your body. And that gave me something to do in a state of complete and total powerlessness. So it showed me early on, though, that I could do things to cope that I didn't know that I could do before, that there were other ways, and that I could make it through really, really difficult things. Not that willpower is sustainable. It's not, but there's definitely moments where it's required. And I was able to do that in that time. But after day 14, I remember saying, well, every day I would say, maybe tomorrow will feel better. Now, I got to tell you, day 14 was horrible. Worst day of my life. Day 15 felt just as bad. But here was the thing. I made it through day 14, so I knew I would make it through day 15. And then after that, it just got a little easier. And I remember on day 30, it was like just everything lifted. Everything just completely lifted. And I experienced that new freedom I hadn't known in a very, very long time. A very, very long time, and that's my story for me about becoming abstinent off of medication assisted treatment. Some people that's their story is different. Some people stay on those medications for longer or for life. And I think if those medications have given you your life back, it's not anybody's position other than a physician to help you make that decision of when you get off it or not. For me, it worked. It definitely worked. And so I got lucky. I got scooped up by this awesome group of young people. They were all like 10 years younger than me. I was in my early 30s. They were all in their early 20s. It was hysterical. They'd all barely had a legal drink, but they would do stuff every single night. They would all go to a meeting, then sometimes go to the next meeting. And then there'd be a bonfire at somebody's house, or there'd be coffee, at the pancake place, or something was going on every single night. And they were so awesome to invite me, and it was especially one friend, Lee, was the one who really came up to me, and, I wasn't used to people reaching out to me. And I remember, the first two times she, kind of asked me if I wanted to do something with them, I declined. And, just out of fear of, I don't know you, but it was the third time she said, man, I'm trying to bond with you. And then I was like, oh, is that what's happening here? And I started to do things, but I tell you, they saved my life. And a huge chunk of those young people are still sober today. So there was some magic in that group, but they did cool stuff. They were, like I said, they were going to meetings, they were working steps, then they would ask you, are you working steps? Like, it wasn't cool to not work steps in this crew. We all had sponsors, then we all sponsored people. Just a lot of really good stuff happening there, and that's, the foundation I got early on was I got connected into the fellowship. I was attending meetings, and then I met a great sponsor. I had already had a sponsor for a very brief period of time. She really wasn't able to work with me very much. She was going through something on her own. And then one day, out of the blue, she just said, Katie, you need to find another sponsor. She was going to receive help for something. And so I knew exactly who I was going to ask, because literally the week before I'd been in a meeting and I heard this woman share, and she was talking about going to the bar with her husband, but leaving with the guy in the band and moving in the middle of the night with black trash bags. And I remember thinking, okay, that's a woman I could actually tell some stuff to. And lo and behold, my one sponsor says she can't work with me anymore. And I was like, well, I think I know who to ask. And that was Nancy. And I call her my first sponsor because she's really the first sponsor I worked steps with. And she changed my life, absolutely changed my life. One of the best things that she did for me was, as she took me through the book and through the steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, she explained everything she did and said, she would explain it and she would say, I'm teaching this to you this way so that you can teach it to another woman. Every step, every page throughout the whole way. I knew from the beginning that I would be sponsoring other women, because that's how she took me through the steps. It wasn't just to take me through, it was to teach me how to teach them. And I remember when we finally got to the last step and we finished 12, she said, okay, now if anybody asks you to sponsor them, you can say yes. And that was such a big deal. I remember that. And, I've been very, very lucky. I have had the opportunity to sponsor a lot of women. And they saved my life. I have a really, really hard time reaching out. I'm a decent responder. I'll give myself decent, but I'm a terrible initiator. It is a character defect. I haven't been able to change it. Despite tons of consequences, it still remains one of my worst. Just a terrible initiator of contact. I don't know if that comes from just so much self-independence. As a kid, I'm very, very comfortable alone and just kind of figuring things out myself. So it's not a natural thing for me. But these girls saved my life because they kept calling. And I would be taking people through the steps all the time. And that has been so critical to my program, because, there was a period of years where I didn't go to as many meetings. My life began to look very different. Like, Joe, when you and I met, 9 years ago, things radically changed. Joe likes to tell the story of on our second date, he asked if he could see me again, and I busted out my big calendar. I said, well, let me check my calendar to try to find him a spot. And now he is my calendar, and he knows that. I basically threw the calendar out and Joe's what I'm doing. Well, that sounded funny. But Joe is
not to everybody. It didn't sound funny to me.
Anyway, my priority is with my family, my children, and we were blending a family too at that time. And so, I did stop going to a lot of meetings, and, the amount of people I sponsored became a lot less, but thankfully, I've never fully disappeared. I've always stayed a part of the fellowship. And even if I wasn't attending a regular home group meeting, I was still showing up to different events and being a part of the conversations and working with an alcoholic on a daily basis and talking to another alcoholic on a daily basis and working on a relationship with a higher power, which, I'm going to give the credit for keeping me sober, despite my best my best actions here at times. But so, I got busy early on. I worked the steps. I did what I was supposed to do. I started sponsoring a lot of women, and then I started to reap the rewards of sober living. I found my husband, got a new home, all these wonderful things, career. And I found myself at 10 years sober having a nervous breakdown again. Um, and I couldn't figure out why. Everything I had wanted had come true. Um, it was triggered by a couple of things. It was triggered by disappointing a friend and her letting me know I had disappointed her. And I remember Joe and I got into an early, argument, which probably wasn't even an argument. And I fell apart over it, thinking we can't have any conflict in our relationship. And I was just completely in a terrible space spiritually. And I realized that I had to start doing a whole lot of AA if I was going to hold it together. And so thankfully, I've always managed to do that when my life started to get crazy again, as it always does. I've always managed to pick up the phone and call my sponsor and get busy again. And so, at that point at 10 years, I started going through the steps for a new experience. And my sponsor and I found something that worked for us in terms of emotional sobriety. And it made a tremendous difference for me. It's where I truly, truly figured out that it was going to be about a relationship with a higher power. That my first 10 years of recovery, a little tiny God was good enough. But I reached a point where that was no longer going to work and that I was going to have to go find a bigger God. And so I just started following the suggestions that's in our literature. It tells us we have to go look for our lost faith, and so I started to take certain actions I wouldn't have taken before, even though I thought they were silly. But ultimately, they led to conscious contact with a higher power. That's the only way I can describe it. And that's where I think how we say, God doesn't make too hard of terms for those who seek him. My experience has been he doesn't make you take too many actions before you find him. One or two literally is about all it takes sometimes for him to show up and you to know it. So it's made a huge difference for me. And today I understand, step 3 in a way that I never understood it before. That turning my will over isn't just a mental exercise. It means I have to come to understand that I don't have any control over the outcome, but I do have control over the actions I take on a daily basis. And so all I can do to exercise my will in the appropriate way is to think, what are the best actions I can take today if I want a certain outcome to occur? And that's it. Ultimately, it's up to God what's going to happen, and those actions can be anything, but they're just determined by whatever it is, we need, whatever we're afraid of, we can ask for certain fears to be removed. There's always an action that we can do. Sometimes it's just do what's, the next right thing. It can be go make a sandwich. Are you hungry? That makes a problem look different sometimes. Have you talked to anybody about it? That definitely makes things look different. Have you put it on paper?
My mama
That
used to say, yeah. No, well, you know this. You made me think. My mom used to always tell me to go brush my teeth. So if you want to change, change your day, go brush your teeth.
That's a good one.
I think of that. And you. So I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, that was a good one.
Sorry.
That was worth it. No.
So how do you define success in your recovery now?
A life restored. That's how I look at it, a life restored, and whatever that looks like for me. Everybody defines it differently. For some people, it can be, there's different aspects of it. You can have abstinence, or you can have, physical fitness. You can have all these things. But for me, it's just a life restored. And that's what I have today.
And what are some of the best things besides getting married that's happened in your recovery? And I think we should say our origin story, because it is kind of related to your story.
Oh, that is true. We should tell her. Okay. So, lots of wonderful things have happened in recovery, but honestly, meeting Joe and marrying Joe it's a very, very cool story. Okay. So you have to understand, I was single for 13 years. That's background on it. Like, I didn't date anybody. My first marriage was enough for me to nope out of that for the rest of my life. So, anytime, I mean, I would run if I thought anybody had any type of interest in me. There was just no way. But about 2 years before I met Joe, I had a sponsor who told me that it wasn't up to me whether or not that I was going to have a relationship with somebody. It was up to God. And so it was suggested that I ask that God remove from me anything that was preventing me from seeing who I was supposed to be with. And so I had done that about 2 years before I met Joe. And this is great because this ties back into the almost graduating thing too, right, honey? So if you remember when I first started telling my story here this evening, I was talking about graduating college in April of 99, sort of. Well, see, I had completed all of my coursework. I had even completed an independent study with a professor in replacement of an internship that I did not have to take because I had over 3,000 hours of service in my field. However, I never turned in the piece of paper that verified those 3,000 hours. And so I technically didn't graduate and get my diploma. And I just always thought, it'd be no big deal. I would call one day and be like, haha, funny story. Never turned in this paper. How do I, what do you want now? I've been in the field 10 years, whatever. Can I have my diploma? And when I called, it actually finally called 17 years later. It actually turned out to be a big deal. They said, no, you actually have to reapply to college and we have to do a degree audit because, the course requirements have changed. You may need to take additional classes. Oops. So thankfully, I had already obtained an associate's degree. And so that's where the majority of the changes occurred. And it turned out I only needed to take 2 classes to get this degree I should have had 17 years before. Now, this degree was in hospitality management, a field I hadn't worked in I think 6 years at that point. And one of my classes was on revenue management. And I had a project where I had to interview a general manager of a hotel about revenue management and then write a paper on it. And I'm thinking, who the hell am I going to interview? I don't know anybody in this field anymore. And then I remembered this guy, Joe. Joe and I were somehow friends on Facebook. I don't know how. Probably one of those, you have 65 friends in common, and they were all recovery people. And so it's like, okay, he's safe enough. But I remember Joe would pop up on my Facebook feed. Now, I'm like a voyeur on there. I don't post. I just scroll and judge. So Joe would always pop up and it would be these really cute posts about like his mom or his daughter. And I just noticed him. And another part of noticing him was that there had been a time a few years before where I had been in a meeting, and I actually remember the first time I ever saw Joe. He did not see me that day. I saw him. I was sitting in the back row of a meeting at our local, recovery clubhouse, and I saw him come in with Ella, who at the time was maybe 3 years old. And he comes in with this big baby bag and this beautiful little girl. And he goes and sits in the front and he is swarmed by this group of people. And they're all laughing and happy to see him. And I remember just kind of watching that and thinking, and just noticing it. Now, not no attraction, nothing like that. Just kind of a, okay. And so that's kind of how it went for the next several years. I would just notice Joe, And so when we get to this point where I now realize I've got to interview a general manager and Joe is basically going to be my person who I need to ask, I think, okay, I'm going to call my friend Holly, who knows him well, and I'm going to ask my friend Holly if she'll ask him if he'll let me interview him. But I swear to God, folks listening, I knew the minute I asked her I was going to marry this guy. I literally thought to myself, if I ask her to do this, I'm going to end up marrying this guy. And that's how it started. Holly called him. He said, okay. I called him. We emailed exchanged. We flirted through email. He asked me if, actually, I think it was me. Was it me? Because we had talked about possibly celebrating with dinner after the interview. And I think it was me at the end of the interview and said about that dinner. So, and we decided to end up meeting for coffee. Because that was much more on my level of okayness. And I want to be careful because there's so much I can tell about this story with Joe. But he was a really, really good sport, guys. I probably dropped 20 of the hardest boundaries on this guy, including you can't touch me.
She recoiled the first time I touched her, for the record, and I just her arm, and she recoiled. It was very. The delusion was smashed. Anyway, no,
No,
I'm
but
very blessed, very blessed.
no, but you were okay with that though, and it was one of the coolest things from the very, very beginning about us was neither one of us were playing around anymore. We were too old and had been through too much to play with people's emotions and feelings. And I think things were very purposeful, but cautious with us from the very beginning. Um, we talked about important stuff and, little by slowly, we really started to, I think, like each other. And then I remember the first weekend we were going away, it was like we told each other all the deep, dark secrets on that car ride. Because I know the more he knows about me, the more facts about me he's armed with, the better off he is. Because those things are going to speak in my life, whether I tell him about it or not. So I remember that being, we both told some pretty big stuff, but nothing was a deal breaker, and it just opened up this place of honesty and safety from the very beginning. And so it was really, really crazy healthy how it all started. But
Mm.
and then things, as slow as they started, they accelerated pretty quickly. I had a ring within 6 months, and 6 months later, we were married. We were actually married just a few days shy of 1 year of that interview.
When you know, you know. When you know, you know. And I'm getting a little emotional. I'm sorry. Listening to you tell that is it's pretty special. So thank you,
Oh,
honey.
thank you.
Um, so, what would you say to someone who maybe is out there struggling right now and is feeling hopeless?
Oh, well, there's definitely hope. I assure you of that. We're living hope. There's always hope. But, you don't have to do this alone. There's a better way to live. You can surrender to this. You know, um, I won't kid you and say it'll be easy, but it'll be worth it. And you'll have people with you every step of the way if you let them.
And this is just because I know, you kind of what you do for a living and that kind of stuff. What are some resources you would recommend for someone who's out there who um, may be looking for help?
I mean, there's a lot of different help out there, and I want to be careful here because, I mean, look, there's a lot of, we'll just bring it down to the level of somebody who's not sure whether or not they have a problem. Okay. If you're unsure, go check out an AA meeting or an NA meeting. Go check out a couple. If you hear yourself, if you hear things that are very relatable, you might be one of us. That's where I would say start. I've seen 1,000 different ways to recover. Most of them will work. I've never seen anybody be successful without the support of other people in recovery, though. I've just not seen it. I mean, it's quite possible, but I've not seen it, and so, start where you can. You can start with simple things. Talk to your primary care physician. I think I may have a problem. You can start with a therapist. I think I might have a problem. But if you're ever in a situation where with certainty that you have a serious problem, there's risks involved with stopping too. You can always go to your local emergency room. That's always an option. If that's not the appropriate place for care, they'll tell you. But if that's where you need to be for safety, then that's appropriate too. But there's lots of great treatment out there now, and there's plenty of grant-based treatment, and there's Medicaid-based insurance treatment available. You may not be able to get, recovery of Malibu. You may not be able to get, 90 days, in a treehouse, but you can get help. I absolutely assure you of that. So.
Thank you, honey.
Mhm.
Is there anything that you wanted to talk about that we didn't?
Probably 1,000 things that I'll think of after we stop. It's a quick conversation, like we said,
Yeah.
but no, I mean, just it's been an incredible 17 years. I mean, incredible. And there was so much, the rebuild, the first 5, 7 years is tough, y'all. To rebuild a life is not an easy thing. There was a lot of struggle, but, I look back and it just was so meaningful. And it's just been, I just am so grateful for what life looks like today and really for every bit of it. And maybe that's the greatest blessing of recovery is that I can look back on all of it now and see the gift in it, truly.
Yeah. Well, you have been a gift to me. And I
Well,
know,
ditto,
you know,
cute.
I'm a little biased, but, but I know that your story can reach people. And I certainly appreciate your willingness to share it with
Yeah.
me in this format.
Well, there's pieces of my story that I don't share in larger forums. I keep those for smaller circles, typically with certain women, so there's always more to every story, but I think really the most important thing to share, it doesn't matter what happened to get here. It takes what it takes, and it's different for each of us. What do you always say, honey? For some people it's a dent in a Mercedes, and for other people it's living under a bridge.
Yep. And most of us are somewhere in between.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I cannot let you go, my love, without our rapid fire questions.
Pew!
I will say this, that at some point we probably will record Katie's pew-pews, because she's been saying to me long before this. Anyway, that's for another time. All right. Are you ready?
No. I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
What is your favorite recovery slogan?
Live and let live.
What is your least favorite recovery slogan?
Think. That's probably
What do you think is your sobriety superpower?
Intuition.
If you could say one thing to your former self, what would it be?
You're okay.
What song do you play to lift your spirits when you need a boost?
Eye of the Tiger.
Nice.
It's the greatest song ever.
If you could grant yourself one wish to help with your recovery, what would it be?
Dang. Well, I'd sure like that part of my brain that lights up and doesn't turn off to go away. Can I have an underactive amygdala?
Did you just say Abdullah Abnamglada?
I did not. I said amygdala. Stop.
What step do you love the most?
Say that again. I missed the beginning of it, Joe.
What step do you love the most?
3.
What step do you love the least?
1.
What is one of your favorite movies?
The Goonies.
And if heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the pearly gates?
I've been dying to meet you.
All right. Well, honey, thank you so much.
Probably say.
I'm not here to judge. I'm here to listen.
Listen.
I really appreciate you, honey. I thank you for sharing your experience, strength, and hope. And
thank you for having me on.
A new episode is released every Thursday at noon. You can listen to the show on your favorite podcast apps, Amazon Audio, Apple Podcasts, Podbean, Spotify, YouTube, and others. Just search for The Cup of Joe Show. Don't forget the "the." Please follow, like, subscribe, and share because someone out there needs to hear this today. Thank you all for listening. Have a good day.
It's just a laid-back vibe, baby.
We hope you enjoyed today's Experience, Strength, and Hope. We are so grateful you decided to join us. Please share this episode with someone who might need it. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe. Remember, no matter where you are in your recovery journey, you are not alone. Reach up and reach out to someone. Please do not suffer in silence. Until next time, let's take it 1 minute, 1 hour, and 1 day at a time. Thanks for listening to the Cup of Joe Show.